Hello, everybody. This is our last lecture for archaeology, chapter 7, part 2. Then this lecture is going to be a little bit shorter, and we're going to be going over what makes a society complex. Okay, so let's get into it. Please read and watch the materials. Definitely watch the lectures. Like, I see people writing some weird stuff down for reflection sometimes. Just watch the lectures. I'm not saying you have to be like 100% attentive all the time, but if I mention it, just know it, and then when you do the reflection, you just refer back to that time, and then you're good to go. Please be sure to complete this week's quiz and reflection. There is a reflection on archaeology to do at the end of the week, as well as a quiz. The quiz is pretty short; it should be like 4 questions or so. So don't worry too much about that, but make sure to get it done. Make sure also these are unlimited attempts, right? So you can do them as many times as possible. But your last submission is the only submission I'm going to grade. If you submit 13 times, I'm not going to look at 13 of the same assignment. Just submit the last one again if you are concerned, and then I'll read that last one. Don't expect me to look at the 3rd or 4th attempt when you've submitted like 6 or 7. All right, good. So tips for reflections: please only use information from class, and make sure to stick to your words. Okay. All right. So let's get into it. What is considered complex and why is this idea flawed? So while I'm going over what makes a society complex, I want you to think about what the definition is, first of all, and why is that definition not the best, essentially. Okay. All right, so social complexity. Control of surplus production by few individuals become evident. Surplus production involved producing more food than bare minimum needed. Okay. Occupational specialization contributed to social stratification. Individuals specialize in various occupations or social roles. So let's talk about this real quickly. So control of surplus production by a few individuals becomes evident. What this is saying is when societies become complex, they usually have a surplus of, let's say, food, right? And a surplus is, as it's mentioned down there, is just producing more than you actually need, right? So if you have surplus money, what surplus money means is that you might need $5, but you have 10, right? So you have a $5 surplus, okay? Now, when there's a complex society, right, a few individuals control what people do with the surplus, right? So a group of people are designated to choose what happens with the extra money or the extra resources, okay? Occupational specialization contributed to social stratification. Occupational specialization is a fancy way of saying specialized jobs, right? And the reason why they don't use job is obviously because quote unquote payment doesn't exactly exist the same way it exists in our society, right? They might have a job, quote unquote, they have to do, but if they don't get paid for it, they just have to do it because it's part of the group, right? So anyway, so think of this word as job specialization. Now, what does job specialization look like back then? It's like making sharper knives, making, better tables, making a better fireplace, whatever, right? These are things that occupational specialization looks like in terms of the archaeological record. Okay. Now, occupational specialization, again, job specialization, contributed to social stratification. Another crazy word. All social stratification means is that there's different categories of people in society, and those different categories receive different treatment because of their categories. So, for example, as a professor at CUNY at Kingsborough, I get paid this much, right? If I were to be a administrator, right? So if I was like, I don't know, like the vice principal, not the vice principal, the vice president, I'd be paid differently, and my responsibilities would be different as well, right? That is a good example of social stratification. Because of our social statuses, we get paid differently depending on what we're doing. Okay. And so basically what this is saying is because there was more job specialization, there were more categories that people needed to, that made people, get resources differently. Okay. So basically, let me give you an example. So let's say Joe is really good at fishing, right? And catches a bunch of fish. Because Joe is really good at fishing, even though he didn't do anything to help hunt the boar or something, right? He gets a lot of boar meat because usually when he fishes, he provides a lot of fish. While the person who is, I don't know, responsible for sweeping or whatever only gets a little bit of boar meat, right? So again, that's how kind of that looked like back then, right? Because the people had different jobs, they were treated differently and given resources differently. All right. So this is kind of like a checklist of what complex societies have. They have large population, extensive division of labor, occupational specialization, and social stratification, right? So large populations, I don't need to explain that. It's just a lot of people. Extensive division of labor is basically they have different ways they divide up the labor, right? So if you look at the extreme opposite, right, with bands, they just divided labor based off of your sex and your age. That's it. But as society gets more and more developed, there are different criteria for people to do certain things. So, for example, oh hey, Joe was a student of Ralph, and Ralph was a great fisher, right? So I think Joe should be the fisher for this community. Or that person has a great interest in making knives. Let's have that person make knives only and not have them hunt or whatever, right? So basically, the criteria, the reasoning for why people did certain jobs was much more complex, or was much more was very different compared to the basic just dividing it on sex and age. Okay. Occupational specialization, we went over that in the last slide, where basically there are specialized jobs. And finally, social stratification, we also went over that last slide, where there are different categories for people, and because they're in different categories, they're treated, or they're given resources differently. Okay, and part of social stratification is usually the definition of class, right? Classes are great groups within hierarchical stratified complex societies, defined primarily in terms of wealth, occupation, or other economic criteria, right? So again, going back to the kind of like the video game example, right, where you have like kings and knights and merchants and peasants and stuff. Those are different classes of people, and in that easy sense, right, they are one based off of wealth, right? So if you're a merchant, you're more wealthy than a peasant, let's say, right? But they're also based off of other things, right? So, for example, knights need to go through certain types of training to become a knight, or the noble class, right? Like kings and stuff, they need to be born, by someone with royal blood in order to be ranked in that way, right? So, that's what classes are. Okay. All right. Archaeological evidence for complex societies. So, complex societies have leave traces of archaeological record in monumental architecture, elaborate burials, artifact concentrations that indicate occupational specialization, and regional settlement hierarchies at least 3 levels. So now we know, kind of have like a base of like what a complex society is. How do we know that a society is complex based off of the archaeological record, right? The first thing is really easy: monumental architecture. If you look at temples, or of course the pyramids, those are clear indicators that they are complex societies, right? And it could be like statues, it could be like bridges, it could be anything. Monumental architecture, right? So basically, architecture that's hard to build. If you see that, then pretty clear indicator that it's a socially complex society. Elaborate burials. Now this is 2 parts. Elaborate burials could be in a physical sense, right? So if you look at our burying practices, right? The coffins are very complex. We have cemeteries that are like designated spaces for people to be buried. We have what are they called? The gravestones, right? That form of it is very obvious, right? Or like if you look at the pharaohs that were buried and mummified in ancient Egypt, right? Those are also good examples that it's elaborate. Now, the other side of that is also cultural, right? Because there are a lot of people who don't do that, but have an elaborate burial ritual. For example, cremation, right? You're just burning a body, right? But what goes into burning the body, right? We still have a wake, we still see the body one more time, and then we cremate the body. That is also an elaborate burial, right? So don't just look at it as physical, but also think of it as cultural as well. If there's like a big gathering for it, okay? Artifact concentration that indicate occupational specialization. This is pretty easy. So like I said before, like occupational specialization, like what's evidence of that is like, hey, this is like a much sharper knife because they have the technology to do it. Or, oh, hey, this pot is like, perfectly round or something. Like those things are clear indicators that a society is complex. And finally, this is the last one. This is hard to kind of see archaeologically, but sometimes it happens. Regional settlement hierarchies at least 3 levels. What this is saying is that there are 3 classes, or 3 different, like 3 different types of classes that exist in that society, right? And how could you see that? basically in the archaeological record. It's like, oh, this one person's buried in like some really random, like really like kind of poorly put together box. This other person is put together in a decent box. And of course, the last person is buried in like a really nice box and has jewelry and stuff with it. By digging all those three up, you can be like, oh, hey, they probably had three different classes of people. And that's the evidence for that. Like I said, that last one is very difficult to see archaeologically. All right, so development of complex societies. So explanations for the rise of complex societies are similar to those explaining domestication. Prime movers or single factors have been developed to explain the rise of complex societies. They're sometimes seen as applying to the rise of all complex societies across the globe. So what this is saying is basically like, the reasons, the motivations, the setting for societies to become complex, it matches those of domestication. That being said, these are some of the examples of what they're talking about, right? So prime movers. Prime movers include domestication, irrigation, population pressure, and social conflict in societies. So domestication supposedly gave people free time to invent complex social rules. So basically, like, hey, we're not starving, we have enough food, so let's try to do more things and let's try to create more rules. Irrigation needs in dry places that require a complex bureaucracy to develop and manage complex canal systems. So basically, what this is saying is in places where it's really hot and you need water and you need irrigation, you needed to develop a system of getting the water to where you are. And that need for water basically forced people to become more complex and develop rules and all this other stuff. Population pressure. This is pretty straightforward. From growing populations that led to the rise of leaders to manage populations. So, hey, there's a lot of people. How are we going to solve our problems, right? You can't always, if Jack steals your tomatoes, you can't just like stab him, right? There needs to be a different way to manage the problems. That's the idea here. And finally, social conflict within societies. Actually, those two are kind of the same. Okay. So the problem, though, is that prime movers rely on unit cause or single cause factors. So all these are very plausible, but the problem is that it's like people think of them as like one thing that led to complex societies. In reality, it's probably multi-causal, right? So Robert Canero's theory is multi-causal and consists of environmental circumscription, population pressure, and warfare. When operating together, these factors led to the rise of the state. So what Robert Canero is saying is that it's not just one thing; it's actually multiple things, right? So the first thing he talks about is the lack of new land because people are settling, so you start having territories. Population pressure, so because you're staying still and you're becoming more stable, you have more people in your society, right? And so it causes more stress on the lands. And then finally, warfare. Conflict rose between neighboring villages. And so those three things are what motivated it to be, motivated society to become complex. Okay. No single factor explains the rise of all complex societies. Written records can provide clues, but are not found in all early complex societies. Early complex societies were unstable. Periods of political unity alternate with those lacking political integration. This can complicate our understanding of complex societies. So basically, this is what I was saying earlier. Just like any other decision that we make in our lives, it's never just one thing, right? Yes. Is that pizza place really good? It is. But guess what? The train's not working today, so I can't get there. So I'm gonna go to another pizza place, right? So it's not just that the pizza tasted good. There's usually other factors that go into us deciding whether or not we're gonna go to that pizza place. It's the same thing. Written records can provide clues, but are not found in all other complex societies. So these last 2 points are kind of explaining why it's difficult to know everything about the complex society. So, yeah, sure, there are some complex societies that write, but a lot of them don't. And just because they did write doesn't mean we can find whatever they wrote on. On top of that, early complex societies were unstable. Periods of political unity alternate with those lacking political integration, and this can complicate our understanding of complex society. So, we have a common society. We have like 1,000 people or whatever, right? And then Farmer Jim and I don't know, and Amy, who makes knives, get into an argument, right? And they split up. Well, guess what? Amy, who makes knives, that means we have no more good knives. And then Jack or whatever, who has, who's a farmer, we don't have any of the domesticated animals, right? They are arguing over something. They fight over it, and then let's say one of them dies, then the whole society's jacked up. You don't. There's no way for us to survive without one of them or without either of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, there are many societies, and if you notice with complex societies, the requirement or all the checklists that we just went over, none of them say that you have to learn. They have to know how to write, right? And this is a great example. So early foragers along South America's Andean coast had monumental architecture before irrigation and agriculture. The Inca Empire rose in the late 1400s and built on earlier complex societies. Monumental architecture, split inheritance system, complex road network, but did not have writing system, right? The empire finally fell in 1525 following the Spanish conquest and Inca Civil War, but their society was very, very complex. I mean, they had a split inheritance system, right? That means that when you pass away, like your property or whatever at that time goes to your offspring. That takes a lot of complex like legal stuff and everything, right? But what's funny is that they didn't have a writing system. Okay, so keep that in mind. Just because they don't have a writing system doesn't mean they're not complex. Okay, so now let's do full circle. What is considered complex and why is the idea flawed? So we went over all those little points about what is considered complex, right? So like especially toward the beginning, right? So monumental architecture, elaborate burials, artifact concentrations that indicate occupational specialization, hierarchies of at least 3 levels, right? All this stuff here, excessive division of labor, large population, so on and so forth, right? So the problem though is that we're really putting a definition on what makes a society complex or not complex, right? And the reason why it's flawed is because just like with the writing system, just because a society doesn't write doesn't mean it's not a complex society. So we're kind of like putting our development into this box when in reality, the ways that our society developed could have been very different. We just don't know. Okay. And to think also that all humans in the world developed like along the same lines is kind of crazy too. Okay, so that's why it's flawed. It's not to say that it's wrong, but it's to say that it is lacking in some inclusion in terms of the reality of our development. Okay. All right. So make sure to get the quiz and the reflection done by the end of the week. That was pretty short, right? If you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cuny.edu.